Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. This time around we're going to be configuring the DHCP server role on KW Server 01. To help out with that, I have a second VM here, DHCP client. This is also a Server 2012 machine. The one and only network adapter is configured to receive IP configuration via DHCP. As we can see, if we look at the current configuration via IP config, we can see that we have a link local address on the 169.254 network. That's because we don't have DHCP server yet. Further to that, if I bring up the settings for this virtual machine, we can see that our network adapter is on custom and VMnet 1 rather than NAT, hence no DHCP. So we're good now as far as a client's concerned for testing. Over to KW Server 01. Before we get started on the configuration, I'm going to bring up the settings on this virtual machine and point out that I now have a second network adapter. So the first one is on the NAT network where it's always been. The second one is also on VMnet 1. So our DHCP client machine and this network adapter on KW Server 1 are on the same network. I haven't configured that adapter yet. Notice that the second network adapter is set for DHCP. This needs to have a static address, so let's get to that now. I'll bring up the network configuration. Before doing the IP config, notice that the names are Ethernet 0 and Ethernet 1 that don't really tell us a whole lot. So as per good practices, I'm going to rename these. I'm going to call Ethernet 0 NAT, which is the network that it's on, and I'm going to call Ethernet 1 internal, which will be the name for that network. And I will bring up the properties, our internal network, IPv4, static, 192.168.1.5, different network, same host address. It's pretty common practice to make things easier to keep track of and manage. If I tab down to the subnet mask, we see it defaults to /24 because of the class. That's exactly what we want. The default gateway is not set, and you can only have one default gateway in a Windows machine. The default gateway is over on the NAT interface, so we're going to leave that there. And we can optionally configure DNS on this interface. Not going to bother with that, so I'll say OK. We get a warning because we didn't configure DNS on the interface. That's OK. And we'll OK out of that and close down our interface config. Now, just to make sure that everything is OK, I'm going to bring up a command prompt. And if I IP config, we will see that our internal interface has an IP address 192.168.1.5/24, NAT interface 192.168.70.5. Again, we have not even /24 in this case. If you remember, we made this one /27. We're good for IP. Time to install the DHCP server role. So manage, add roles and features. I'll move the wizard up here a bit so we can see it better. Role-based on this server. We're going to install the DHCP server role. I will add the features that install the administrative tools. I do not need any additional features beyond that. And a little bit about the service and then the install. So I'll go ahead and get the installation started with that. Now, one of the things I did not do is hit the checkbox that allows me to restart the server once the service is installed. I happen to know from experience with this particular role that a restart is not required. The installation is mostly complete. So we'll hang on here for a second until the wizard finishes, and then we'll be able to carry on and actually configure the role once that's done. Okay, the role is now installed. I'm going to close the wizard off. We'll see that there is a notification. I'm going to select that, and we need to complete the DHCP configuration. I'm going to select that. Now, this is a little bit different. This doesn't actually configure a scope. What this does is allows us to authorize the role or the service. In the Active Directory environment, many of the services that we have must be authorized against Active Directory to work, and DHCP happens to be one of those. So I'm just going to go through next. The only thing we have to tell it is what credentials we're going to use to allow the authorization to take place. By default, it's who I'm logged in as. This is a domain admin, so I've got plenty of rights. I'll say commit. And the top part, creating security groups, is passed. It says the authorization has failed. Now, I don't know if I really believe that because I've seen that happen in many cases before. So I'm just going to leave this as it is for now. And I'm going to close this out. We can see that the DHCP service is listed over here on the left, so we can use that to see any errors, any events, that type of a thing that we might have. Right now, what I want to do is create a scope for that internal network. So I'm going to go to Tools. I'm going to pick the DHCP server, and I'm just going to make the window for this a little bit bigger so that we have a little bit more room to work with. Here's the server itself. If I expand this out, we can see IPv4 and IPv6. Now, because these are checked green and they're actually operating, I know that the server is actually authorized to work. Expand out IPv4. There are no scopes, so we're going to create one. I'm going to right-click on IPv4 and select the new scope option. It's going to launch the new scope wizard. Go through next. We need a name. I'm going to call this Kitchener Internal. And now we can specify the network and the range of IP addresses that are going to be in the dynamic pool. Now, the way this wizard works is a little interesting. We basically specify the range of addresses. So I'm going to say 192.168.1.1 up through 192.168.1.254. It will automatically select CIDR 24 based on the fact that I used a Class C network. We can change this to whatever we need to. In our case, we don't have to because it is /24. But notice there's nowhere to actually put in a network address. So based on the range of IP addresses and then the CIDR value or the subnet mask, whichever you prefer, it's going to figure out what the network address is. Go through next. Now, exclusions. We know that the first 50 addresses are not supposed to be in the dynamic pool. We're going to use those for static assignment. So I'm going to put in a range of 192.168.1.1 through 192.168.1.50. And I'm going to add that in as an exclusion. So basically, these IP addresses are not ever going to be handed out dynamically. They're going to be set aside for static assignment in that particular scope. Go next. Set the lease time. I'm going to change this from 8 days to 24 hours or a day. And we have the option now of setting up options. I don't want to do that. I could, but I want to show you how you add options after the fact. So I'm going to say no and say next and finish. And our scope is now created. So we can see the network address, which is automatically determined from the range and the CIDR value, and then the name. Now, this has a down arrow on it right now because the scope has not been activated. I don't want to activate the scope yet because I want to set the options first. Before we get in there, I'm going to expand this out, look at the address pool. So here's the range and any exclusions. You can have multiple exclusions if you wish. Leases, don't have any yet, which is fine. Now we have both scope options and server options. Scope options apply only to the scope. Things like routers, which are going to be very specific to the actual scope itself because of the network address. I'm going to pick scope options. We don't have any. I'm going to right click and configure options. I'm going to pick the router, so I'll select that and put in the IP address for the router. In this case, we're going to say 192.168.1.1 and add. Always remember the add. If you don't and exit out of here, you're not going to have your options set. Now, we don't actually have a router here, but that's okay. We'll set this up anyway. And I'll say OK. So here is our scope option. Now, I also want to set up the DNS server. So I'm going to do that in server options because I want that particular option to apply to all of the scopes. So I'll pick server options. Again, we don't have any right now. Right click, options. I'm going to configure option 6, which is DNS servers. I'm going to add in the IP of KW server 1, so 192.168.1.5. So I want to add that in. It's going to check to see if there's actually a DNS server at that address. Didn't give us an error, so we're good with that. And I'll say OK. So server option and then scope options. Now notice when you select the scope options, you see options that are defined in the scope and also options that are defined on the server that apply to the scope. And you can tell by the icon on the left whether this is a scope option or if it's a server option. Everything's basically configured. The only thing I need to do now is activate the scope. So I can right click on the scope itself. We can see this activate function. I'll simply select that and I'm now done. The scope is now ready to start serving IP configurations out onto the network. If you ever need to do some work on the scope and you need to take it offline, then right click on the scope and deactivate. But we're not going to do that. We want to go over and see how our DHCP client is doing. I'm going to switch over to DHCP client. And I am going to tell this in IP config to renew the IP configuration. If I could spell IP config correctly. And as long as DHCP is running, we should get an address. And here we are. So we have an address 192.168.1.51. So the first address that's going to be available within the scope. This is good. Default gateway 192.168.1.1, exactly the way we configured it. And if I do an IP config all, just expand this out, we will see that we also have our DNS server 192.168.1.5. So we're basically good on the client end. And just to round this out, I'll pack back over onto KW server 01. In the scope, if I look at the leases, I'll just refresh this and we can see that 192.168.1.51 is assigned to DHCP client and the lease expiration is 24 hours from now. That's basically it. We have DHCP server set up. We've proven that it works. In a production environment, if you have a large number of subnets that need DHCP, you would simply add on many different scopes, one for each one of those subnets, and then whatever options have to be configured within that. So that's it for the video. Hopefully this has been helpful for you, and we'll see you next time.